Hello friends, Rob Caskie of Engaging Storytelling. Following on from my previous story about the background to the Anglo-Zulu War, there are so many wonderful characters on both sides of this conflict that make this story the wonderful one it is. And we try hard in these stories to develop the human beings and the little cameos surrounding them for your enjoyment. You may hear some diesel tractor noise in the background. This is a very busy time here in the Midlands where folks are burning fire breaks, which are crucial for the containment and the control of runaway fires, and we decided to proceed outside regardless. And I would like, in the theme of these stories and the human beings within them, to share a little bit with you this morning about a remarkable man called Henry Charles Harford, who belonged to the 99th Duke of Edinburgh Regiment. You know, Harford is an interesting individual, and he pops up at so many auspicious events in the Anglo-Zulu War that David Rattray used him as a conduit and indeed as a glue to keep much of these stories together. I should add that David Rattray did an honours degree in entomology, and Charles Harford was an inveterate beetle collector. He loved collecting beetles. He had an enormous collection of beetles, and David Rattray always said, Charlie Harford was my friend. And in that vein, Charles Harford as a child, just as a toddler, living in England, he was on the second floor of their family home, and he saw his mother outside in the garden, and this dear little toddler moved out to a big bay window and toppled out of the window onto a spiked metal fence below. It was appalling. One of the spikes had basically entered the groin area at his left thigh and left hip. Another had pierced his abdomen. Another had entered his skull. The wounds were horrendous. Some of his entrails were protruding. The doctors gave him no chance at all. But Charles Harford survived. He said the left side of his body was always considerably weaker than the right. He ended up with a left leg that was slightly shorter than the right and left him with a little bit of a limp, but it hardly seemed to impede him, and he would live on to the ripe old age of 74. As if that was not enough, as a child he was taken across to India, where he nearly died of dysentery. His family relented that he be taken off to an Indian village for treatment. They had no details of the treatment that was administered, but were indeed very grateful that their son's life was saved. And Charles Harford spent much of his early adult life, and indeed some of his teenage life, in Natal, where, of course, for a beetle collector, life was just a dream. They spent much time hunting and fishing and beetle collecting and egg collecting. His stories of fishing on some of these wonderful rivers and indeed in the sea are fantastic. And in it all, he learned to speak some Zulu. And although he was a member of the 99th Duke of Edinburgh Regiment, Charles Harford was very involved with Lonsdale's contingent of Natal Native Contingent Fellows. I've not mentioned this yet, but in 1878, with the preparations being made for war against the Zulus, the British were involved in a very inconvenient and expensive campaign in Afghanistan. They did not want another campaign in another part of the world, and indeed had spoken out forcibly against any war taking place against the Zulus and said, do not go to war with the Zulus. And in that circumstance, the officials here in Natal decided to wager a war on their own account, believing it would be over inside of 3 weeks. But as such, they couldn't ask for reinforcements. So they began to collect black men out of Natal, Zulus who were living in exile south of the Buffalo and the Tugela River, to indeed act and fight with the British. They were called the Natal Native Contingent. They were barefooted, dressed and equipped as Zulus, armed as Zulus, but given a red bandana to tie around their head to indicate they were fighting for the British. That bandana was normally worn around the upper left arm. You can rest assured that when things went wrong in the big fights, off came the bandana and they bolted, which is largely why they survived. Now, Charles Harford, I wonder what he thought about this war being prepared for against his comrades and friends, the Zulus. And I don't think that Harford was really a soldier. I think that he saw soldiering and the army indeed as a means to an end, to improve his beetle collection, to see some of the country, to record new species and specimens, and so forth. Now, in the build-up to the war, A man called Sir Henry Edward Bartle Frere had been pulled out of retirement to try and achieve the Confederation. And he saw fit in this uneasy time to put Buffalo border agents and magistrates along the Buffalo River and the Tugela River, which had been decided upon from 1843 onwards to constitute the border between the colony of Natal and the sovereign territory of Zululand. And he told those men working for the British Crown, you scrutinize the border and see where the integrity of the border is impinged upon by Zulu activity. Didn't have to wait long. In the winter of 1878, two sons of a famous Zulu chieftain called Sekhayo Gatlangongobas of the Gungaba people crossed the Buffalo River near Rorke's Drift to seize two of their father's young wives, who indeed were cohabiting with one of the Buffalo border agents of Frere's on the Natal bank of the river. They dragged these women back to the Natal bank and they were there stoned to death. It was the Zulu custom at that time. And that was seized upon to constitute a cross-border affair. And with it, the British took the opportunity to use it as an excuse to issue the Zulus with an ultimatum. That ultimatum was read out to the Zulus on the 11th of December 1878 beneath a huge sycamore fig tree on the lower banks of the Tugela at the position of the present John Ross Bridge. That document took an hour and a half to read to the Zulus in the Queen's English to Zulu people who were indeed illiterate, and they were expected to take it back to their king by memory alone. But the most important thrust of the ultimatum was that the Zulus had to disband their army within 30 days, otherwise the British would come and disband it for them. The Zulus found it impossible to answer the terms of the ultimatum. Their army stood as the centerpiece of their national identity, an army which hitherto had shown no aggressive intent towards the British. Well, as plans for war were being made, the Zulu king still trying hard to effect a peace, intrigued at how the British queen, whom he considered he loved, and her people could be waging a war against his devoted Zulu people. And the plan for the opening invasion of the war was to invade Zululand with 5 columns, 3 big columns, 2 small columns, totaling roughly 15,000 men. The central column was accompanied by Lord Chelmsford, the commander-in-chief, and with that central column of 4,850 men was none other than our friend Charles Harford, the beetle collector. And on the 12th of January 1879, in rain and drizzle, Chelmsford decided to attack the Gungaba people of the chieftain Sekhayo in their stronghold of the Ngatla Ridge, which lies roughly midway between Rorke's Drift and the St. Luana battlefield and camp. In that stronghold of cliffs, Harford was requested to lead a group of Natal native contingent fellows into battle, and Harford objected. He said, "Sir, I think it's a bit rude, don't you? Expecting me, a mere beetle collector, to lead this jittery bunch of black untrained untrainables into battle for the first time." Well, his senior commander, a man called George Maury Hamilton Brown, patted him on the back and said, "Oh, Charlie, you'll be fine." Now, I want you to imagine the scene. The Zulu elders and warriors have been assembled to Lundi, their capital, by their king to try and find a diplomatic means to avoid a war, leaving aged women and children at their village, Sakak, in the presence of a few young warriors. And that is the force that Harford was leading his Natal native contingent against that fateful day. Well, as they moved up into these cliffs of the Ngatla Ridge, a voice rang out from a cave above, in English, learnt on the diamond fields of Kimberley. And the voice shouted, "By whose orders do you come?" And Duncombe, a fellow officer to Harford, shouted, "We come in the name of the Great White Queen." Well, the Queen didn't know who Zulus were or where Zululand was, I'm sure. And in it, a scuffle developed. Harford, in the meantime, fell to the ground, and a great shout went up that Harford was dead, Harford was down, and Hamilton Brown rushed forward to stop the fight and found this young officer who'd expressed his horror at going into battle for the first time, not dead or injured, but down on his hands and knees, transferring a rare beetle of the Elytridae family into a matchbox. This is the stuff of legends. This is the basis of the British Empire. The beetle was in the box, Harford was alive, the battle could proceed, and indeed it did. 31 of Sekhayo's people were killed that day, his village destroyed, his livestock driven off, and Chelmsford said to the men, "You see, it's going to be easy. All we have to do is get these people to stand and fight. Well, it was with that attitude and that complacency that they would proceed and establish a camp beneath that fateful sphinx-shaped mountain, Isandlwana. Isn't it intriguing to consider that the Queen's colour that was sent off the field in the dying moments of that battle would be lost in the Buffalo River? And the British, the eternal optimists that they are, decided 2 weeks after the loss of the colour to send out a patrol to try and recover or find that Queen's colour. As fate would have it, they found the colour. I'm going to tell that story subsequently. Harford was amongst the patrol. It was his needle-sharp beetle-collecting eyes that spotted 3 inches of stick sticking out of the Buffalo River that had receded enough to expose the end of the colour pole. And he said to a friend of his called Harbour, "I say, Harbour, that looks to me like the colour pole." They pulled it free. It was the Queen's colour intact. Harford was allowed to ride some of the way back to Rorke's Drift with the Queen's colour on the right boot in the saddle and stirrup of his horse. Very importantly, Charles Harford was with the patrol that arrived at Rorke's Drift the morning after the battle. And he said, "I cantered up towards the post and I saw some man on top of the store with a Union flag. I thought it was a Zulu ruse, a trap or an ambush. So he looked with a telescope and said, I saw it was a white man. A grubby, exhausted, terrified little fellow, but a white man." Well, Charles Harford said, "As we moved up to the post, I could see men lying along the barricades at Rorke's Drift, who I assumed were dead. And there were a few men sitting on that final redoubt of mealie bags that had been built in the middle of the night by the brave defenders of Rorke's Drift." And Harford said, "I could see their mouths were moving, but I could hear nothing." And Harford said, "I was so embarrassed because I suddenly realized that they were attempting to cheer, but were too exhausted to do so. And Harford said, I began to cheer. With every cell in my body, I began to cheer when I realized that the post had been held. And 2,700 men behind me, a mile away down at the river, began to cheer when they realized that the post had been held." It was probably one of the only pleasant surprises of the entire campaign for the British. Do you know that David Rattray once gave a lecture in Herefordshire, Harford's home county? And after a lecture, there's always a crowd of people to meet David. And in that crowd, David noticed a little old lady, and David made his way across to her. She had a beautiful jacket on, and with a trembling hand, she reached inside of her jacket, and she said, "Mr. Rattray, Charles Harford was my grandfather. He died in this county, 1937, age 74. And he once wrote me a letter to say that that morning at Rorke's Drift, when he realized that the post had been held, was the finest moment of his entire life." I just want you to know that. I've never forgotten that. And there are these characters that come out of the Anglo-Zulu War that make this the beguiling, magnificent tale that it is. This book about Charles Harford, a wonderful gift from my dear friend Justin Wateridge, the managing director of Steps Travel, who send guests all over the world to the most unusual and unconventional destinations, and a man indeed who organized my first trip to Antarctica on the 14th of December of 2011. This is a beautiful book, and in it is recorded very carefully the life and times of Charles Harford, including his experiences in the Anglo-Zulu War. I hope you've enjoyed this little tidbit about a remarkable young officer, Charles Harford, more interested in beetles than he was in battle, and that you will continue with me on this journey of storytelling and sharing together. Thank you.